In Genesis 11, it says Abraham set out from Ur of the Chaldeans. In almost all commentaries, this is said to be the ancient Sumerian city of Ur. But this creates a problem. Abraham lived during the Middle Bronze Age, and the Chaldeans did not migrate to southern Mesopotamia until the first millennium BC. So if Abraham set out from Ur of southern Mesopotamia, it wasn't Ur of the Chaldeans yet. Most scholars believe this is an anachronism. A later author or editor added the reference to the Chaldeans, so the Israelites of his time knew that Abraham came from southern Mesopotamia, which was called Chaldea in this later time. However, this might not be accurate. The internal biblical evidence suggests Abraham could not have come from southern Mesopotamia, and his original homeland is somewhere else. Ur of the Chaldeans may be an entirely different city in the north, in the land the Chaldeans originated from, and this would suggest the tradition of Abraham setting out from Ur of the Chaldeans is an early tradition, not a later anachronism. The first thing to note is it would not be an issue if the reference to the Chaldeans in Genesis 11 came from a later editor. The Pentateuch contains updated place names. In Genesis 14:14, it says Abraham went into the land of Dan. Since Abraham's great-grandson had not been born yet, and his later descendants had not yet settled there, this would not have been called the land of Dan during the time of Abraham. Genesis 47 says Jacob settled in the land of Ramesses, but the name Ramesses came from the later time period of the Exodus. Genesis 36 refers to the time when kings reigned in Israel. This line was obviously written after kings began reigning in Israel. It would not be an issue if Ur of the Chaldeans was also an updated place name. Ancient texts like the Pentateuch were often updated by later tradents and scribes, so the audience of their day could better understand the texts. This is similar to how the modern translators came out with the New King James Version. The language of the King James was updated for a modern audience. It was common in the ancient world to update texts and add commentary so later audiences could better understand them. For example, the book of Jeremiah is 1/7 shorter in the Septuagint than it is in the Masoretic text. What likely happened is a Jewish author living in exile added commentary to the book so the exiled Jews could better understand what Jeremiah taught. The Septuagint version does not have this additional commentary, so we can observe how texts were updated without changing the inherent teaching of the work. Despite this, when it comes to Ur of the Chaldeans in Genesis, which is called Ur Kasdim in the Hebrew text, this might not be an updated place name, but an early way to distinguish it as a different city from the metropolis in southern Mesopotamia. In the early 20th century, Sir Leonard Woolley excavated the site of Ur and came to the conclusion this was the original homeland of Abraham. This became the consensus view and remains a possibility. But internal evidence suggests Abraham probably didn't come from Ur of southern Mesopotamia, but another Ur of northern Mesopotamia. Deuteronomy 26:5 says Abraham was a wandering Aramean. Arameans were from the region of northern Mesopotamia. Ezekiel says Abraham was an Amorite and Sarah was a Hittite. The Sumerian term for Amorite meant Westerner, and they seem to have equated several people from the north and west as Amorites. Mark Chavalas says, "It appears that the Amorites were not a people in any ethnic or political sense. The idea that they were social outsiders also appears to be outdated. Porter has proposed that they had social ties to local populations, i.e., mobile herding communities belonging to the same peoples as their settled counterparts. Thus, they were not a separate people, but one dimension of the general populace." The Hittites were in Asia Minor, northern Mesopotamia, and Canaan. If Ezekiel says Abraham was an Amorite and Sarah a Hittite, this would suggest a more northwestern location. Deuteronomy also suggests Abraham came from the north if he was an Aramean. Of course, it's possible that Abraham was an Amorite and an Aramean, living in southern Mesopotamia, and also just so happened to acquire a Hittite wife, who was also his half-sister. But given these ethnicities, it makes more sense that Abraham originated in northern Mesopotamia. Genesis also teaches that when Abraham and his family set out for Canaan, they came to Haran and settled there until Terah died. If one were traveling to Canaan from southern Mesopotamia, it wouldn't make sense to stop in Haran, as it was out of the way of major trade routes in the region, which went through the city of Mari before turning west. Heading further north to Haran would be quite a long detour. More importantly, biblical evidence points to a northern location. Genesis 24 says Abraham sent his servant back to his homeland to find a bride for Isaac. The servant went to Paddan Aram in the north to look for Nahor's family that was still in Haran. Abraham's origin city of Ur was probably in the general region, since he referred to this area as his homeland. Joshua 24 says the fathers of the Israelites lived beyond the Euphrates. The southern city of Ur is not beyond the Euphrates, it is on the western side. So this city doesn't fit the description in Joshua 24, Gary Rensburg says. In theory, Joshua 24 could be referring to Haran, which is north of the Euphrates River, but recall that the city was simply a way station, as it were, on the journey from Ur Kasdim to Canaan. Furthermore, the implication of the phrase, "your forefathers dwelt beyond the river in olden times," implies that the original homeland, which was Ur Kasdim, according to Genesis 11 and 15, was also beyond the Euphrates. In light of all this, Sumerian Ur cannot be the referent, as it is on the same side of the Euphrates as Canaan. Given all this, scholars like Gary Rensburg and Herschel Shanks have argued the lost city of Abraham is not Ur of southern Mesopotamia, but Urfa, located in the north of the region. Local inhabitants still identify this as the original city of Abraham. It is also less than 20 kilometers from the famous Gobla Tepe site, which dates back to around 9500 BC. Urfa also fits better with the biblical data, as it is in the region of the Hittites and Arameans. It is beyond the Euphrates, and if one were to travel to Canaan from here, it would be reasonable to stop in Haran. Rensburg adds that the names of Abraham's ancestors, Serug and Nahor, are also the names of cities in the general region of Urfa. Nahor, known from Akkadian sources, even if its precise location in Upper Mesopotamia is unknown, and Serug, well known from later Syriac sources, whose name persists in modern Turkish Surik, 46 kilometers southwest of Urfa. So the names of Abraham's relatives also fit better with a northern location. Thus the names, ethnicities, and geography all point to the northern city of Urfa. This is most likely the same city mentioned in Ugaritic cuneiform tablets, which is called Ura, and said to be in the land of the Hittites. It is important to note in ancient records, we have more than one city that can be designated as Ur, Herschel Shanks said. One thing seems clear, there was more than one Ur. Places named Ur, or something linguistically close enough to it, to be a candidate for biblical Ur, such as Ura, have turned up in numerous ancient inscriptions, at Ugarit, on the Mediterranean coast in modern Syria, at Nuzi in northeastern Iraq, at Alalak in Turkey, about 100 miles north of Ugarit, and more recently, in the extraordinary archive from Elba in northern Syria east of Ugarit. The Elba tablets include references to places called Ur, Ura, and Urau. But one could object that Genesis says it was Ur of the Chaldeans. We know in the first millennium BC that southern Mesopotamia was also called Chaldea. So why locate Ur outside of Chaldea? The problem with this line of reasoning is we know the Chaldeans were not native to that region, and in fact, they migrated to the south from northern Mesopotamia. Xenophon referred to Chaldeans still in the north. He said they were a warlike people who blocked the way to Armenia, and were neighbors of the Armenians, but at war with them. This would place them in the region of northern Mesopotamia. However, Bob Becking argues the term Chaldean could not have been a designator for a people group in the second millennium BC. So Genesis must be anachronistic when it says Abraham set out from Ur of the Chaldeans. To quote, this is an obvious anachronism, since the Aramaic-speaking tribe only entered the stage of history in the 8th century BCE. But this is no longer true. Rand Zadok recently published a 12th century BC Assyrian text that mentions the Chaldeans. It says the king of Mari took counsel with himself as to the structure of his house, and due to the hostile Chaldeans and Arameans, he built this enclosure wall and city gate. This text suggests that the Chaldeans were already a well-known hostile people group, and that they had such influence that the king of Mari had to build a new wall and gate for protection. It also links the Chaldeans with the Arameans, which aligns with the Pentateuch stating that Abraham was an Aramean from the land of the Chaldeans. As Zadok says, the main historical significance of this inscription is that it demonstrates that not only the Arameans, whose earliest datable occurrence is in 1111 BCE, but also the Chaldeans reached the Middle Habor Valley early in Tiglath-Pileser's I's reign, just a decade after the earliest occurrence of the Arameans, if not before. This inscription of Ashur-Ketalizer II proves beyond doubt that the early abode of the Chaldeans was located in the Jazira, and that their presence was the coeval with that of the Arameans. If the fact that they are the first member in the pair, the Chaldeans and the Arameans, is at all significant, one may tentatively suggest that they were even more important than the Arameans in the eyes of Ashur-Ketalizer II. This is still, of course, centuries before Abraham, but it does place the reference closer to the time of Moses and within the 2nd millennium BC. The Chaldeans clearly existed before they migrated to southern Mesopotamia, and they would have lived in the northern region during this period. Even if the Chaldeans were not a people group during the time of Abraham, new evidence now suggests they were known to have existed close to the time of Moses. So the reference to them in Genesis 11 could also have been a way for the Israelites in the pre-monarchic period to reference the original city of Abraham, and therefore it would still be an early tradition that dates to the earliest period of when the Pentateuch could have been written. Thus, the reference to Ur being of the Chaldeans does not indicate it must be the Ur of southern Mesopotamia, and given the biblical evidence, Genesis is probably referring to another city called Ur in the north that was beyond the Euphrates and in the region of the Arameans and the Hittites. Genesis 11:31 is not referring to Ur of southern Mesopotamia, and therefore is probably not anachronistic. And additionally, the reference is probably early, given that the biblical evidence suggests a northern location for Ur, and that during the 1st millennium, the Chaldeans migrated to southern Mesopotamia and then conquered the region. An Israelite writing after this had happened would not have identified southern Ur of the Chaldeans as the homeland of Abraham, since now the Chaldeans were in the south and no longer the north. In other words, since according to the biblical texts, Abraham's Ur is in the north, it suggests this tradition originates to a time when the Chaldeans were still there and had not yet migrated to the south. Thus, we have more evidence Genesis contains ancient traditions that fit with the 2nd millennium BC. Abraham came out of the north, the original Ur of the Chaldeans, before heading to Canaan. The lost city of Abraham is Urfa, which is beyond the Euphrates, and not Ur of the Sumerians.